All right, so it's time for me to winterize this engine. And up front here, this is the raw water pump. So this has a closed cooling system. So it's actually called freshwater cooling. So the way it works is this bottom hose here goes to the back, and I'll show that. That's actually the output of the transmission oil cooler and engine oil cooler, and the input of that cooler actually comes from the output of the sea strainer. So I'll show that in the back. But basically the raw water from the lake comes in here, and then this is the pump and the impellers in here, and I'll take this cap off too as part of this. And so it pumps in here and it comes out, and what it does is then it goes in this heat exchanger. So this heat exchanger then it pumps up to the top, and then there are two hoses that actually go out, one to both exhausts, both left and right exhaust, so the risers. And so the raw water that comes in goes up through the heat exchanger and then goes out, and that's what goes out the exhaust. So it helps cool the exhaust during normal operation and quiet the exhaust too. But then this heat exchanger, the closed cooling system, you can see this hose here is part of the closed cooling system. And so this pumps basically antifreeze through that heat exchanger, and then so so the raw water from the lake cools that, and then this is what goes and cools the engine. So what I need to do, I'm going to be disconnecting this hose first, and then I'll try to see if I can raise it up somehow and drain this as good as I can. I may pour a little of the RV antifreeze in it, because there's a low spot there back further up. And then I will take this hose, probably I'll take this off, but the bottom of this heat exchanger, and that's what I gotta do, is remove this hose. And the bottom of this heat exchanger, there's actually a valve that I can open up, and then what it'll do is it'll drain this, it'll drain the raw water from this heat exchanger. And so I need to do that too, and that's gonna be hard to get to. I'll have to see how I'm gonna do that. And the other thing that I need to do is I will disconnect this hose and raise it up just to make sure that water drains out of it. Same thing here. Remember this is what goes to the riser there on the starboard side, and I will disconnect that and then raise this up just to make sure there's no water right in here, which there could be a little bit. So that bottom hose, if you remember, that's one of the ones with water in it, coming from the sea strainer, actually through the oil and oil cooler and transmission oil cooler. But I'm not able to get that bottom hose, I'm not able to pull that off. So what I did, and I'll show you here in a second. So what I did is in the sea strainer, this hose here, this is what comes from up through my intake, goes up in there and then down out that one, and that one goes down and comes up here, and here's the engine oil cooler and transmission oil cooler, and then it goes across, and I'll show in a second where that actually then goes to that hose I was just pointing at. So what I did is I took my shop vac and I sucked out, first I drained this. I just put a bucket under my boat and open up that valve, and the water pickup, which is down there, I just let the water drain, which pretty much drained all of the water from this side. But this side, I took my shop vac and stuck it down in that hole and sucked out as much water as I could, and it looks like it sucked all of this out. In fact, possibly even on the other side. I'll show that here in a second. So the other side of that transmission oil and engine oil cooler, it comes out right here. And so what I did is I disconnected those hose from that, and then this hose is the one that runs down and goes, it's that bottom hose right there, and that's the one I cannot get it off from that water pump. So what I did is after I sucked the water, like I mentioned just a minute ago, out, when I pulled this hose off, there was no water here, so I took my shop vac and I even put it on here on this hose to suck out, because this hose goes down, you know, it's kind of a low spot. But I think most of the water is sucked out of this hose. What I'm probably going to do is pour a little bit of a RV antifreeze in this in case there's any water down in there. But everything else appears to be dry. And another thing that I did do is I talked about having this, I had this elbow out, and I mentioned how it was dry. The output of that engine oil cooler and transmission oil cooler. Well, I went ahead and took my shop vac with this out and just stuck it in that hose there and made sure that that was open, and then just sucked out from there to make sure there was no water in that cooler, the engine oil and transmission oil cooler. So the other thing I'm going to do is I may pour a little bit down in that hose where I stuck my shop vac, or the hole I stuck my shop vac in that sea strainer. I may pour just a little bit of RV antifreeze down in there too, just in case. Oh, and the other thing that I did actually is when I pulled the cap off of this water pump, that front plate, quite a bit of water came out, and the water that was draining out would have been water that was in this heat exchanger, and it would have drained down close to basically the level of that. So most of that drained out. And then what I did is I took this hose apart, and more water came out a little bit from here, and then what I did is I sucked out the rest, so the majority of this water is out. So now what I'm going to do is there's a little valve on the bottom of this heat exchanger. I'm going to open that up and drain the remaining water out. And then the other thing I'm going to do is this hose here, this is the one on the port riser. This is where the lake water comes up and gets pumped up, if you remember, from the heat exchanger, and then it goes out the exhaust. And so you can see on the other side there, on the starboard side, I have that one actually off. So I lifted that up just to make sure if there's any water in that hose, it'll go in the heat exchanger. And then I'm just going to take this one off and just lift that end up, make sure that there's any residual water in this. It'll go down in the heat exchanger. I'll do that first before I open that valve on the bottom of the heat exchanger. So here I'm showing the port side, that hose that comes off the top of the heat exchanger goes to the port side riser. I have that off, and I just lifted it up. There wasn't any water in it, but just to make sure. And then this just naturally drains out, so I don't have to worry about any water in there. And one comment, when I mentioned about how the water in these risers naturally drains out, I did confirm that with the engine manufacturer, Marine Power. And another note on getting these off, this hose and that one, they're a little sticky. It takes a little bit to kind of work them loose, so that's just something to watch out for. I forgot to mention when I was talking about when I used my shop vac to suck the water out back there. I was just talking about, I cracked this cap open of that rod water pump, exposed the impeller a little bit, and that way air could flow in there, and so I did do that. So I did pour a little RV antifreeze down in that hose. I took this elbow off when I pulled that out, and then I took it off this hose and I Stuck a little funnel down in there and poured just a little bit of RV antifreeze in there. And then I also took that cap off and I poured a little RV antifreeze in. Maybe I'll go to the other side. But I did pour it in basically the side where this comes in. What I did is I opened up that main valve and poured a little antifreeze in there and let it drain out the bottom of the boat, and then I closed that valve right there, the main one, and then poured a little bit more in it, so they're just RV antifreeze is sitting in that hose there. And then I also took that fitting apart. I've got a still picture of it. I'll show it here. And then I put a funnel in and I poured some RV antifreeze in that bottom hose so it sits in the bottom of that heat exchanger. And then what I just mentioned, how I poured water in the sea strainer on this side of it, so there's RV antifreeze in there. But on the other side that goes down and then comes up in this hose, which goes the input of the transmission and engine oil cooler right there, I poured a little bit of antifreeze down because this hose has got a low spot, so I've got RV antifreeze sitting in there too. So in summary, to winterize this engine cooling system, first thing to do is open this cap so it's not airtight, and then come and open this main valve and let that water drain out the bottom of the boat there. You can see that's where the pickup is. Let that drain out and come up front, crack open that cap, and then what I did is I had a container actually like this under it and let the water go in there to the front of the impeller. And then once it, basically what that's doing is draining the heat exchanger, at least partially. Let that, leave that open like that, and come back here with my shop vac and suck out the side that actually goes right here up into that engine and transmission oil cooler. And so let that suck out good. And then another thing has to be done is take this end of this hose off and just lift it up, make sure water drains out of there, and do the same on that side. Take that hose off and lift that up, make sure all that water drains out of there. Then disconnect that fitting right there where those two rubber hoses go. That one hose is the one that comes out the bottom of this heat exchanger. And have another, empty that bucket and then that container, put it under there because more water will come out, and let that drain down. And then take this fitting off, this elbow, pull that out, stick the shop vac in the output of that engine transmission oil cooler, make sure that's sucked out good, and stick the shop vac in this side to suck out this better to make sure that's good and cleaned out of water. And then take the shop vac and suck it, basically suck out that small hose going to the bottom of the heat exchanger. What I actually did too is I took that cap off and I made sure that was drained out good, and then I took like a pipe cleaner and made sure there was no little bit of residual water in between the vanes of the impeller. And then there's that little valve at the bottom of that heat exchanger. Unscrew that, and hardly anything comes out actually. And screw that back on, and then put a little bit of RV antifreeze in here, the bottom of that short hose, and then pour some in here, a little bit in this, so it sits in that hose. A note related to winterizing, but about the exhaust system. So when I get this boat done one of these years, my intent is actually to make sure that these exhaust hoses are drained. My intent is basically just to have the boat, when it's on the trailer, put on a little hill and let that drain out, because remember, my exhaust hoses are pretty much horizontal. I know that's not recommended, but I didn't have any other way I could see of doing it this way, so I knew that was something I was going to have to deal with as far as winterizing. But if this boat were on a little hill, that would just drain out, no problem. But in the garage here, what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to just take the exhaust apart a little bit so I can just make sure there's no water in there, because there's probably a little bit in there up in these elbows, and probably just laying in there, and possibly in the mufflers too a little bit. So I will have to do that.